Okay, that looks like everyone has been able to join. So welcome everyone to this intelligence briefing about the changing global landscape of modern slavery and human trafficking, or MSHT for short. Today, we'll be talking through some really interesting themes, including how traffickers are adapting to global shifts in contexts, the technology and tools that financial institutions can use to detect and disrupt these crimes, as well as then the data that the financial industry can give to law enforcement to help in this fight. But to begin, I'd like to introduce Themis to those of you who aren't already familiar with us, as well as then our speakers today. As an award-winning digital anti-financial crime platform, we help our clients do due diligence on all of their clients, suppliers, and third parties, all in one place. Our platform is powered by our data, research, and intelligence. And a major part of that work as a financial crime specialist is the in-depth primary research we carry out into predicate crimes which help our clients understand the various threats and risks that they may be exposed to. Over the last 4 years, our in-house research team has done particularly extensive work analyzing the evolving scale, nature, and also impacts of modern slavery and human trafficking, which is what we're here to discuss about today. So welcome all again. I'm Olivia Baker, a researcher here in the Insight team at Themis, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm really pleased to be joined by two real subject matter experts, Nadia O'Shaughnessy, our head of research, and Olivia Dakeyne, our insight manager, and also our modern slavery and human trafficking lead. Both have researched, written, and spoken extensively on the topic of modern slavery and human trafficking, and have a huge amount of really fascinating insights to share with you today. So to begin, Olivia, I know you've been doing some really interesting research into this topic. Perhaps you can start us off with some background context and some statistics so we get an idea of the current scale of modern slavery.
Yeah, absolutely. So the most recent International Labour Organization report on the global estimates of modern slavery that was published last November, so almost a year ago, has got some really comprehensive estimates on this, and they include, under the banner of modern slavery, forced labour, forced marriage and sexual exploitation as well. And that organisation estimates that globally there are about 50 million people worldwide living in conditions of modern slavery today, which I'm sure you agree is a really staggering number and really shows the kind of vast and increasing scale of this crime. And it's also very high in relation to the previous estimates by the ILO. So they were produced back in 2016. And at that point, it estimated that 40 million people were living in conditions of modern slavery. So that's an increase of 10 million over 5 or 6 years. And to try and put that into context, that's like the population of either Rome or Paris, or the combined population of Birmingham, Bristol, and Greater Manchester, all entering into conditions of modern slavery and human trafficking every single year for 5 years. So just to pull out some of the other figures on this slide, you can see migrant adult workers, they're 3 times more likely to be in forced labour than non-migrant adult workers. That's a very vulnerable population to exploitation. That also ties into the fact that 50% of those people in forced labour and 25% of those in forced marriage are actually found in upper, middle or high income countries, and that can surprise some people. So these are often migrant workers working in the domestic or hospitality industries, agriculture as well, development and construction work. There's sort of child brides, foreign brides, or possibly forced marriages as well, where girls particularly are sent over from other countries to marry people, particularly men in higher income jurisdictions. And children and women are disproportionately vulnerable. I'll come on to that more in a second, mostly because they tend to fall victim to human traffickers across all of those spectrums. So for the purposes of sexual exploitation, forced marriage and forced labour, whereas on the whole, and I am obviously generalising, there are exceptions, but on the whole, men tend to be used more predominantly for the purposes of forced labour alone, certainly much more than they are in the other categories. And the last figure on this slide, which I find particularly troubling, is that 14% of forced labour is actually accounted for by state-imposed forced labour. So I think we've probably all become more aware of that over the last couple of years. There are sanctions relating to the treatment of Uyghur Muslims in China. There are boycotts over cotton production in Turkmenistan, for example. And I think 14%, it's a horrible number to think that that's kind of perpetrated by governments who are supposed to be looking after their people. But to try and sort of turn that on our head and turn it into a positive, that's 86% of forced labour that's in the private sector. So again, a horribly big number, but actually that 86% is going to be much more within our control as individuals, as businesses, particularly the financial sector and law enforcement, to do something about. So, hopefully all of us here on this research briefing should be in a better position to tackle that 86% of forced labour.
No, sorry. Thanks, Olivia. And yeah, as you were saying, those really are huge numbers, really concerning. I wonder then if you could perhaps explain some of the other trends that we're seeing in terms of how this works on a more day-to-day basis. So how are MSHT activities being run compared to how they were previously?
Yeah, of course. So one of the main things that's really underpinning a lot of the changes that we're seeing is a shift in actually who the traffickers are and how they're operating. So previously, we were seeing a lot of small family gangs and lone operators as well undertaking human trafficking activity. There's a very definite shift now towards these larger, quite sprawling, organised crime gangs that are really operating at a transnational level. And I'll come back to some of the repercussions of that and how we're seeing that manifest later on. But first, I think it's important to lay out the kind of philosophy or impetus that's underlying this shift and why these larger operations are being joined to the trade. So a lot of that is to do with these criminal gangs running human trafficking operations according to and sort of as a very standard, if very strategic business model. We know that modern slavery and human trafficking is defined as a financial crime. That is, it's profit driven. That's really the main motivation for undertaking it. And there are two main strands of that financial motivation, as you can see on this slide here. So on the right-hand side, that's the opportunity that human trafficking affords for actually reducing existing costs. So this can be as straightforward as using free or exploitatively cheap labour for existing operations, and those operations could be in criminal markets or legitimate ones. We're seeing this in a couple of different industries. A really key example is the meat manufacturing industry, particularly in Germany, but also kind of Ireland, Austria, and Brazil. It's adjacent to agriculture, which a lot of people are aware of, that's quite a high-risk industry, sort of seasonal fruit picking, things like that. But this is these sort of huge meat packing slaughterhouses in the middle of these countries where there are not really many passers-by. And victims are really forced to work in very dangerous conditions for little to no salary. The traffickers can further save costs by not investing in health and safety, for example, worker benefits, pensions, things like that. So they're getting more work for less money, be that through underpayment or non-payment of wages, and also through very excessive working hours without any overtime payment as well. And then the other side of this business model, so on the left-hand side of the page, that's how trafficking victims can be used to generate revenue. So there's direct money to be made from them. Traffickers, keep them in terrible conditions, really cramped and overcrowded accommodation, which they actually charge their victims through the nose for. So victims are really having to pay the people who've trafficked them for the places where they're effectively being kept prisoner in a lot of cases. So the traffickers actually deduct large sums from their victims' wages or claim that their victims are in debt to them and must continue to work to repay that debt, and that debt mounts up. And that's also the case for sort of so-called recruitment fees, or the physical tools that trafficking victims need to work, clothes, food and transportation as well. And then the main aspect really is the work that these victims are undertaking to generate income for their traffickers as well. And that can be in licit markets or illicit markets. As I've mentioned, we talked a little bit about legitimate industries like meatpacking and agriculture. Construction is a big one, domestic work. But I will talk a little bit more as well about the illegal activities which are increasingly being undertaken by human trafficking victims, because that also relates to the shift that we're seeing in who the traffickers themselves are. As I mentioned, we're seeing much more involvement of these serious organised crime gangs now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really helps us grasp why traffickers are being drawn into this business model, as you called it. And that's one of the reasons that we are seeing some more gang-based involvement rather than just lone operators. So what are some of the other trends or changes perhaps we're seeing in this crime type as compared to a few years ago?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And I think it makes sense to start again by looking at the involvement of these organised crime gangs that are operating transnationally, as I said, because that really impacts on one of the main things we're seeing more of, which is that human trafficking victims are increasingly used to undertake a whole range of other financial crimes and illegal activities on behalf of these crime gangs. So they're effectively de-risking these activities for their traffickers. They're allowing them to operate at a much greater scale and scope. They're allowing them to diversify their trade across multiple income streams. So again, it's talking about these criminal endeavours in a kind of business model parlance and language, because that's actually, the criminals are strategizing in that same kind of way. And it's long been the case that trafficking victims use as drug mules, for example. I think that's something that I'm sure all of you will be familiar with. They're absolutely still being used to transport physical goods like drugs, like arms, illicit gold, things like that. But we're also seeing a couple of major new trends. Organised retail crime is one of them. That's really on the rise, particularly in the kind of North and West Hemisphere. So gangs employing trafficking victims in endeavours like professional shoplifting, cargo theft as well, retail crime rings, and this goes beyond the scale of sort of petty theft that's gone to a kind of prolific scale, but goes up to the level of really sort of highly trained career criminals operating very, very highly organised networks and moving around from shop to shop, from city to city, country to country, state to state, and staying kind of one step ahead of law enforcement. So it's kind of like the next logical step up from organised begging rings, for example, which is a quite well established model for trafficking victims. And cybercrime, that's another arena in which traffic victims are increasingly used, seeing it quite a lot in Asia, so particularly Cambodia, with migrants being kind of lured, so from other places like Africa, Vietnam, Thailand, kind of lured into these online cyber scamming camps under the sort of guise that it's a sort of well-paid and respectable job, and then they're forced to scam individuals in the West. We've had reports of these victims as well. If they refuse to work or if they get too ill to work, they might be used as blood slaves, so having their blood forcibly taken for sale on the black market, or having their organs, including their corneas, harvested for sale on the black market. So again, if you look at that in terms of that really profit-driven model, the traffickers are using, it's kind of really maximising and capitalising on the investment that they've made in these victims. So using them initially for forced labour to generate more income and profit, and then when they cease to be useful in that way, turning them into a physical commodity to sell off in parts. So it's almost like divestment, really. And that's also the case for sexual exploitation. Girls' organs have been forcibly taken and sold when they stop being able or willing to work. Or they're sort of raped and forced to have babies, and those babies are sold on the black market. That's another quite lucrative model. And these organised profit-making trafficking activities that extend to terrorist organisations as well. We know that some of these raise funds through slave auctions or demanding ransom payments for trafficked victims, using their victims in organised begging rings or domestic servitude or kind of forced marriage to their militants, or actually forcing victims to fight for them as well. We know that that's been employed by ISIL, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and the Lord's Resistance Army, for example.
Thanks, Olivia. Yeah, that's pretty awful stuff to hear, and quite terrible. But I really do hope that it drives home even more the importance of stopping human trafficking. And I believe that you're also doing some research on the environmental aspects of this crime. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. Really interested in that. So the other big thing that's emerging, as you say, this very strong link between climate change and human trafficking, actually. And a very good part of this is that victims of human trafficking are often used to undertake a huge array of environmental crimes, waste crime, but illegal deforestation, particularly, that's a massive one, that's required for illegal logging or the illicit trade in charcoal or illegal mining, to clear the land for these activities. And then these trafficking victims are often then used to undertake the illegal mining activities, for example, as well themselves. So coltan in the DRC, that's something that we know a lot of trafficking victims are involved in. And a really striking statistic on this that's really stayed with me. So an estimated 40% of deforestation worldwide is carried out by enslaved workers. And kind of because of that, modern slavery has been called the world's third largest carbon emitter. So to try and put that another way, if every single human trafficking victim or kind of modern slave in the world actually had a nationality, they all had the same nationality, they all belonged to the same country, then through absolutely no fault of their own, that would be the third largest emitter globally of carbon emissions, behind the US and China, which I think is really striking. And then that relationship with climate change, it's a bidirectional one, so it works the other way as well, in that climate change actually exacerbates human trafficking activity. Traffickers really take advantage of the havoc that's being wrought by climate change to obtain more victims. So climate disasters. We've seen that a lot this year. They cause mass displacement from things like floods, hurricanes, fires. They destroy homes and livelihoods, and that makes people much more vulnerable to traffickers. They've had their homes taken away from them, their livelihoods taken away. And we know that traffickers really thrive in refugee camps. For example, the Ukraine, that was a really, really big one. One that's really stayed with me is India. There is a refugee camp that was established after the 2004 tsunami there, and it became known as Kidneyville because so many women there sold a kidney to support their families. And when I say sold, it makes it sound like they were getting something for it. Maybe it wasn't trafficking, it was willing, but these women, they might enter into that trade willingly because they have absolutely no other way of supporting themselves or their family. But they could see around them a lot of their the fellow women that were kind of selling these kidneys were being scammed. They had the foreknowledge that they might not be getting any money at all, but they just had absolutely nothing else apart from their own bodies to sell. And most of the time they would end up with no payment at all, or if any payment, a real fraction of the price. And often, these operations were quite botched and left them with really, really bad health outcomes, which meant that actually in the future, they weren't then able to work. Once they got out of these refugee camps, their livelihoods were kind of pretty much destroyed in perpetuity, which is really kind of devastating for these women. More recently, we've been seeing traffickers stealing babies from refugee camps in Asia. So these kind of refugee camps that people have been displaced by floods, for example, and then these babies can be sold on the black market. That's a really lucrative trade. And traffickers, they really prey on people in these camps because they just, they're sort of law and order vacuums. They might be separated from family. They've got no one really to look out for them. They've lost absolutely everything and they've just got no other way of supporting themselves. So, that sense of desperation can be really easily manipulated.
Yeah, and you touched on it just quickly, but how does the sort of current geopolitical landscape feed into that? I guess it must be having an effect as well.
Yeah, definitely. So I mentioned the Ukraine briefly, but that's a very, very potent example of how these refugee camps act as kind of law and order vacuums. So in the weeks following the invasion last year, quite horribly, online searches for Ukrainian women reportedly really skyrocketed. And these organised trafficking rings were sort of watching this, and they kind of interpreted that online demand as a really strong financial incentive. And so they started sending what they called kind of reps or dickers, on the ground people, to refugee camps and border crossings to take photos of women and children. And these photos were then kind of passed up to the higher echelons of these organised criminal structures to assess trafficking suitability. Which is really, really horrible. And, these women refugees are vulnerable not just to sex trafficking, but also labour abuse. They often end up in less well-regulated, quite informal sectors like domestic work, au pair work, which leaves them at risk of exploitation. And then the other thing with climate change, of course, is that it increases competition for natural resources. So it exacerbates violent conflict in that way as well. So it feeds into this kind of vicious reinforcing cycle. I think that really shows how traffickers are taking advantage of geopolitical situations. And then one last thing, which I think is really fascinating, as I've kind of mentioned a little bit throughout, is that we're seeing these crime gangs become much more transnational in nature and also so much bigger and really run like businesses in a very organised fashion. And there are a huge amount of reasons for this. There's a very, very intertangled kind of set of reasons. But one that I find really fascinating is trying to interpret it in the light of human trafficking. So if you think about the fact that all these gangs are increasingly using human trafficking victims to undertake activities like growing and producing and trafficking drugs, that's a really standard sort of organised crime gang activity. Human trafficking is so transnational in nature. If you think about some of the really well-worn trafficking routes, so Vietnam to the UK, for example, that in order to get victims there, you're having to cross Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Czech Republic, Russia, from Africa up to Europe through the Middle East, huge amount of countries that you're passing through. So these operations require a really extensive international network of agents to kind of facilitate and bribe and extort and transport victims across the globe, through ports, through borders, across borders. And you need to have the right connections to the right people in the right places. So organised crime gangs that have historically had very tight hierarchical structures with maybe a single crime boss or kingpin at their heads, we're starting to see a new model emerging, which is so sort of Chinese triad, Italian mafia, these well-established gangs. They're kind of evolving, they're sort of loosening, they're flattening their structures, and they're really collaborating with each other so that they can operate transnationally with greater ease and greater agility. So again, if you think about these structures as operating like businesses, when you're kind of expanding and businesses and trying to operate at a global level, you often have regional heads, and you're kind of spreading that power across the organization. So again, sort of using that business parlance, that's what these gangs are doing. They're becoming a bit more decentralized and more collaborative in nature, and that's kind of what we're seeing happening here. So it's thought that around 70% of these groups are now multinational in membership, which is kind of enabling them to penetrate new illicit markets more easily and at greater scale.
Thank you, Olivia. That really is interesting to, hear those about those interlinkages with human trafficking, and how much, I guess, really has changed as a result of the increasing incidence of this crime. Moving on to you, Nadia, is there anything that you would like to add in terms of the changing method, perhaps, that traffickers are now using?
Absolutely. Thank you both, Olivia's. So if we stay on this slide, we'll see some logos we'll see Airbnb, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat. And that's because we're frequently seeing traffickers use digital services, fintechs, and social media platforms in ways that actually leave a trace and a trail, which is quite useful for law enforcement agencies. So for instance, Airbnb and its equivalents might be used to house trafficking victims who can be kept at each location on a short-time basis and then relocated quite quickly and nimbly to avoid detection. And actually, sometimes these accommodations often actually host sex trafficking activities in a way that's a bit more hidden and less exposed to things like security cameras than traditional locations like hotels might be. So that's a really worrying trend. And then when we look at the social media platforms in turn, well, they're often used and harnessed for the logistics of trafficking, so the buying, the selling, the advertising and transporting of victims, as well as luring them in the first place. And there's some worrying but important data to back this up. So in 2020, for instance, a US-based not-for-profit called the Human Trafficking Institute released a report which found that Facebook was the most commonly used platform to groom and recruit children by sex traffickers. And this was based on an analysis of over 100 federal child sex trafficking cases from that year. In this report, Instagram was ranked second most prevalent and Snapchat coming third. So I think what we can see is that in the past, child trafficking used to take place in the classified ad sections of newspapers often, and has just now moved online and has been facilitated by some of these new methodologies and without traffickers having to pay for ads at the present time. So let's maybe take a step back and look at the implications of this. So the vast global scale of human trafficking activities, and also this evolving landscape whereby criminals are quick to adapt to new methodologies and to exploit opportunities. Just to rewind, this means that we really need to employ a whole system approach to tackling it on our side too. And I can't overemphasize the importance of working together and collaboratively to share data, intelligence, and expertise so that new methods of working and modus operandi are all shared in as real time as we can possibly manage. So what role do all the different actors in this slide have? So NGOs have a really key role in collecting on the ground data and helping victims, whereas the private sector can help to provide intelligence to law enforcement to launch some of these investigations and identify potential perpetrators. And we'll talk more about that shortly as well. And then legal services and the judiciary in securing prosecutions and convictions. So that really shows how everyone needs to be working together as one coherent whole. And then thank you, Olivia, if we turn to the next slide. So honing in on some of the intelligence that the private sector can provide, you can see here the different types of financial services industries. So if we think about retail banks and private banks, for instance, these institutions can submit suspicious activity reports based on the suspicions that arise when someone might be making or receiving payments from their accounts, and if there's a mismatch with their customer profile with regard to those payments. So just to illustrate this in practice with an example, one of our contacts, a former detective in Northern Ireland with the police service there, managed to actually open and run an investigation which led to the conviction of the largest human trafficking case in Northern Ireland under the current legislation. And the police was alerted to this on the basis of a suspicious activity report, really showing their value there. So it was raised by the perpetrator's bank, detailing a mismatch between his profile as a retired individual and his financial activity. So the large amount of cash that was flowing through his bank accounts just didn't look consistent with a pensioner, basically. And they also reported that he was paying a huge amount for fuel in different areas of the country. So it looked like he was constantly driving around Northern Ireland, and that there were multiple transactions happening as he was doing so, and that he was paying for a high volume of adult services web ads as well. And this actually matched up exactly with what he was doing, which was advertising online and then driving female victims around the country for the purposes of exploitation. So he was actually eventually convicted of 29 separate offences related to 12 separate individual female victims who were exploited. So really showing the power of financial services industry data there. And of course, if we think about it, different sectors will have different touch points with trafficking activities, and therefore there are different types of intelligence that they might be able to provide. So in retail and private banks, which is the example I've just used, the risks might relate more to taking on a trafficker as a customer, and that customer then trying to launder the proceeds of their trafficking through the bank. So it would be transactional data that we're getting through these institutions. But if we look at subsectors like investment and fund management, for example, well, if every bank that provides these services refuse to lend and invest in activities tainted by human trafficking, then a huge amount of that funding would actually be cut off, and they wouldn't be able to finance their operations to anywhere near the same extent. So the power of finance as a leverage tool there really can't be forgotten.
Thanks, Nadia. That was a really good case study to sort of illustrate the power of data and intelligence in the fight against this heinous crime. And it's really important, I think, to recognize those different ways in which we can trace these criminals. And it's incredibly clear that data can have such a transformative effect on victims' lives. And it really is often just at our fingertips. And I know we have a number of recommendations for firms that are looking to better detect and disrupt this crime. So would you maybe be able to take us through some of those as well, just to finish off?
Of course, for sure. So there are a few things we'd recommend, actually. Firstly, we'd advocate that you use our financial crime risk assessment tool to measure downstream risk from third-party suppliers. And I'm just going to play you a little video here now to illustrate better what this means and what this is. Thank you. So the risk assessment is a very useful tool. The other way in which we can help with our tech is through our platform, Themis Search and Monitoring. So this platform enables you to actually conduct screening on all of your clients, your suppliers, your investments, your investors, third parties, using our tool. And it's a unique resource because it's underpinned by this layer of our own unique proprietary data of modern slavery and human trafficking related convictions and adverse media, which this second short video will give you a demo of.
Themis' special interest list is a unique database of criminal convictions that has been curated by our own in-house team of specialist researchers. It holds data from over 60 jurisdictions and covers a broad range of financial crime types, including corruption, fraud, illegal wildlife trading, modern slavery and human trafficking, money laundering, and terrorist financing. The special interest list underpins Themis Search, which is our end-to-end financial crime screening platform that allows you to search for any individual or company in the world for links to financial crime. Today we're going to search for an individual called Claudia Ferenkova. We can now screen this individual to see whether she has been sanctioned or subject to any financial crime-related adverse media or law enforcement. The first profile is marked as a 100% match, and so we can safely say that this is the individual in question. If we look at the adverse media, we can clearly see that she was convicted for her role in an organised crime group which was guilty of human trafficking and money laundering. We can also press expand on this node to check whether there are any associated individuals, companies, and operations. We can then add these to the risk map. If we select Gejza, we can see that he too was involved in the same organised crime group as Claudia. If we hover over the organised crime group node, we can see a description of the modern slavery and human trafficking operation that Gejza and Claudia were involved in. This details how they lured vulnerable people from Slovakia to the UK and forced them to effectively work for free. We can then add each person to ongoing daily monitoring. This means Themis Search will automatically alert us via email if these people are subject to further adverse media, law enforcement, and so on. This investigation illustrates how our unique database can play an integral role in helping you minimize your exposure to companies and individuals involved in financial crime. Our special interest list is also unparalleled in its reliability, as it draws exclusively upon official conviction data published by national and international authorities. This data is accessible to our clients via Themis Search. It is an integral proprietary data source that differentiates our platform from other screening and monitoring systems.
So then the final resource that we'd recommend is the UK's National Anti-Slavery Digital Learning, which was launched in March last year and which is actually freely available to everyone working in the financial services industry and beyond. This digital learning was developed by the UK government's National Modern Slavery Training Delivery Group, the UK's Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner and Themis, with support from our partners Unseen, Red Compass Labs and Allianz Bernstein, and the course is accredited by the London Institute of Banking and Finance. So this training resource is really helpful in that it's highly tailored to different sectors and roles within the financial services industry, and it features a lot of interactive guidance for those specific subsectors, which include crypto, retail banking, corporate banking, investment management, and accountancy, to name a few. It also really features a diverse range of multimedia supports, including insights and video clips from leading specialists in the field, from HSBC, Nationwide, Fidelis, Anti-Slavery International, Transparency International, to name a few. So how can you access the module? Well, it can be taken directly via Themis's website on themisknowledge.com or via a SCORM package that organisations can take onto their own learning management system if they have one. And then lastly, on Themis's website, we have a really rich hub, the Anti-Slavery Hub, which contains a lot of additional resources, guidance, podcasts, news articles, reports on the topic of modern slavery and human trafficking too.
Great, thank you, Nadia. It really feels like that's a truly comprehensive and multi-pronged approach that firms can take to safeguard themselves against exposure to modern slavery and human trafficking. So hopefully some really useful and practical tips for our audience there. So we actually have a couple minutes now to take some questions from the audience. So first up, we can take one from Ruth, and she asks, in the era of global supply chains, what challenges arrive for businesses in addressing modern slavery today? Olivia, how about I send that one to you to begin with?
Yeah, why not? It's a really good question, Ruth. I think I could probably be very long-winded in the way that I answer. I'll try and keep it brief. Okay, first point, I think there's just so much modern slavery and human trafficking out there. As I said earlier, it's an estimated 50 million people worldwide at the moment living in those conditions, and an estimated 86% of that in the private sector. So if you look at that on a global scale, that is so many different entities with potential links to modern slavery that you might be working with. And increasingly, you know, companies have so many entities in their supply chains as well. There's so much outsourcing. So I think the scale of it is probably one of the biggest challenges. I think corresponding to that is a risk that people might see that certain suppliers are working with their peers or competitors or other very big well-known brands or companies, and assume that maybe those other entities have done their due diligence or know more than them, and that by default, therefore, these other companies that they want to work with are therefore clean or sort of okay to work with. I used to do some freelance due diligence previously, and some of the companies that I worked for, the clients, they actually asked me specifically to do research on what kind of analogous or peer companies the sort of entity that they were researching had worked with before, and actually to make an assumption about how likely it was that these companies had conducted their own due diligence on that entity, which I can only presume was so that they could make some sort of value judgment or risk assessment and deem it safer if a big and well-known entity or lots of different companies had already done supposed due diligence and deemed them acceptable. So I think that that practice is a bad way of looking at it. We've seen with companies like Sony and BMW and Apple, for example, really big companies. They've all used suppliers and factories that make use of forced labour. So you really can't assume that other people have any better knowledge than you or any more ethical processes than you do. Kind of think of it in the same way, you know, if you're going to a cafe or like a food van at a festival or something, there's always a really long queue outside one, and then there are kind of other empty places, and everyone just keeps on joining the longest queue because you assume that people have got better knowledge than you, they've got like the insider scoop on what's good, but actually probably half the people, 3/4 of the people in that queue have joined it just because there are already some people there. They don't know anything more than you. It doesn't mean that the product is any better. And then I think another really huge risk with global supply chains is navigating the different approaches to regulation in different regions and jurisdictions. So, you know, they all vary in terms of how stringent they are, and also sort of cultural relativism, really, that's a big one. You know, what's deemed acceptable or commonplace in different areas. We all have very different value systems, which are really kind of shaped by our culture and the societies and contexts that we live in. So when you're dealing with entities from around the world, you know, you need to kind of take that into account. Not everyone is going to ascribe those same value judgments as you, or necessarily think the same things that you think are wrong or right. And, you know, obviously everyone's got totally different pressures, and actually we're very comparatively cushioned in our society. So we don't have those pressures to make those decisions in the same way that a lot of people in other countries do. And then I think lastly, probably linked to that, is the increasing amount of disruption in global supply chains, you know, caused by violence, conflict, extreme weather conditions, geopolitics. So that challenges global supply chains in a lot of ways, kind of logistically, but they also increase the instance of human trafficking, as we've already talked about. So, you know, correspondingly, they're going to increase very specific risks of forced labour making its way into your supply chain as well. Sorry, that was quite long.
Okay, you're very comprehensive, so thank you, Olivia. And we have another question here from Sarah. She asks, how can companies collaborate with NGOs, governments, and other stakeholders to combat modern-day slavery effectively? Nadia, I'll hand that one over to you, as you did touch on this a bit earlier.
Absolutely. So thanks, Sarah. Great question. And you're right, Olivia, I talked earlier about the importance of this sort of comprehensive cross-sectoral response, because the other side, so the traffickers, are collaborating and working so transnationally. So we really need to do the same. And I mentioned our free anti-slavery digital learning, which is a really good example of this sort of collaboration working firsthand. It was a product of a public-private partnership between us, the government, and NGOs. So those human trafficking charities we mentioned earlier, and it was financed by several financial institutions and the government as well. So it had that private sector aspect to it. I think it really is testament to the power of working together in this way, because we all had different perspectives, knowledge and resources to leverage in creating it. and which was really helpful in ensuring that the training was relevant to all potential users across the subsectors I mentioned earlier. And then that we had the expert first-hand experience from those different sectors to feed into it too. And it's been taken by thousands and thousands of learners since it was launched, which I think really shows the power and usefulness of different groups coming together to collaborate too. And then looking beyond the digital learning in terms of other examples, I think there's a really nice initiative and coalition of financial institutions and survivor support organisations, which it's worth mentioning as well, called Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking, so FAST, and they aim to help support trafficking survivors with access to financial services, which is often a real hurdle. So there are lots of ways that the private sector can get involved. I think all you really need to do as a first step is just ask.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's always good when we can give an example of our own work that we've done here at Themis. And I really do agree with you on that survivor financial inclusion initiative. It's a really important one. So we have an interesting one from Lisa. Are there any benefits to tackling modern slavery and human trafficking risks in terms of business performance, rather than from an ethical standpoint? Olivia, how about I give that one to you?
Yeah, another really great question. I'm very happy to take that one. So there are definitely lots of statistics around how much clients and consumers vote with their feet and their wallets around these things. I think one recent study found that 60% of consumers said that they would switch products if they knew that human trafficking or forced labour was used to create it. I know obviously that sometimes what people do and what people say are two different things, but I think that's quite powerful. I really think that awareness of firms' responsibility for their suppliers has massively risen in the past couple of years. I think the pandemic actually had a lot to do with that. You know, a lot of existing injustices seem to come to a bit more of a head, and there was a feeling of kind of increased digital and armchair activism, I think. So the public are really making more informed and ethical choices about where they put their money, and I think there are a lot of research papers that do support that. I guess that said, it will be interesting maybe to analyse in a couple of years' time, in retrospect, what happened during this period of rising costs and inflation. I think, you know, consumer purchasing patterns can be affected. You know, this period of rising costs, moral and ethical conscience might get sort of quieted a little bit when there's the trade-off of paying more for even very basic products in the moment. So that will be an interesting one to see trends on. In terms of investors, though, as opposed to consumers, again, there's a lot of evidence that they're increasingly taking these sorts of issues very seriously. I read an article which quoted the global head of social impact and human rights at Nestle, and he said that when he joined the company 12 years ago, he might attend on average one call a month, possibly, with investors asking him about sort of challenging in and kind of scrutinizing their sort of Nestle supply chain and suppliers and controls, and asking about human rights and things like that. And he said that these days it's more like one call every 2 days. So that's sort of real exponential increase there. And actually, a couple of years ago, Just Capital, which is a company which monitors the effect of business on society, found that companies that explicitly mention human rights in their supplier code of conduct really tended to outperform those whose code omitted them. And again, you know, that was something I mentioned, the kind of due diligence work that I used to do, but I was always explicitly asked by clients increasingly, so towards the kind of latter end of my freelance work, to really interrogate companies' approaches to human rights and modern slavery. So I think it is definitely something which companies and individuals are increasingly looking at when they're deciding on business relationships and where to put their money as well.
Well, I think that settles that pretty clearly, and that there's really no excuse not to look into these sorts of risks to your business. So we do have time for one more question. So let's take this one here from Matt. What are the key indicators that a company may have links to modern day slavery, and how can these be addressed proactively? Nadia, how about you take that final one?
No problem. I have a simple answer, Matt. I'd really recommend you actually look at our anti-slavery digital learning, because it should be really helpful in that it goes into all the different indicators and red flags for different types of financial institutions. And the training also talks about the kind of merits versus disadvantages of divestment versus engagement. In general, we're proponents of the latter. So really working with your suppliers to make changes and enable them to, as you say, address those risks proactively, rather than necessarily immediately just dumping them as a supplier. Because if you give them deadlines and measurable milestones to hit, and if you work together with them to achieve these on the basis that it is a shared problem, then it's more likely to make a real difference. And, really do try to look for these risks. Don't hope that you're not going to find them, because then you're not going to be able to do anything about the issue. So, as I mentioned earlier, tools like our risk assessment and screening software are really good ways to investigate this risk exposure in your business relationships and in your supply chain too.
Well, thanks for all your questions, everyone. And I'm sorry that we don't have any more time to take any further questions, but we are coming to the end of the session at this point. So I think to Olivia and Nadia, I'd just like to ask you both for a quick one-sentence takeaway for the audience to leave with today. So Olivia, how about we start with you?
Always challenging to keep it to one sentence. I think the really important one for me is actually what Nadia just mentioned. So as all the ways that she suggested to kind of put in the work to find how your business might be linked with human trafficking so that you can do something about it. So seeing those touch points as an opportunity to make change, to detect and disrupt this crime, to really, really make a difference as a citizen of this world. So actively looking for it and thinking, if you find it, that's a good thing, I can do something about it, rather than hoping that you don't find it and thinking that it'll just be a black mark against you. Really viewing that as an opportunity to help.
And Nadia, how about you?
I'd fully agree with Olivia, but I'd also add about the importance of data in the fight against this crime, and really encourage businesses to take the time to realise this wealth of data that they're sitting on in relation to modern slavery and human trafficking, and how that can be really harvested and used for the greater good. And sharing that information more widely across the industry as well is really key.
Well, thanks so much, both. And I think that those are really important points to end on. So thank you for that. And I just want to round off this call today with a call to action to ask the audience to please spread the word amongst your colleagues and friends and family about the issue that we've discussed here today, and also about some of the resources that we have available, including our platform, Themis Search and Monitoring, our supply chain risk assessment, and our free anti-slavery digital learning on our Anti-Slavery Digital Hub. And please do get in touch if you would like any more information on any of these. We also have a whole range of briefing notes and podcasts and blogs that are all free on this subject, as well as many others on our website. And just one last thing I would like to mention too as a company. Themis is trying to raise £50,000 by undertaking a 50 million step challenge leading up to Anti-Slavery Day on the 18th of October. So we are on the final push now with just a month or so to go. And as you heard at the start of the intelligence briefing, there are around 50 million people worldwide living in conditions of modern slavery. And we're really trying to stop this through the work of our charitable foundation. So at the end, we'll send around details of this challenge after the webinar, but we really would appreciate it and love it if you would be able to support us in raising awareness of this awful crime. I hope our audience has found this as fascinating and as interesting as I have. And so thanks again to both of our panelists. We have covered a number of important themes and hopefully really given you a sense of how we can take action to protect your business from exposure to this heinous crime. As I said, we'll be sending around a post-event email with links to all of these resources that we've mentioned. But again, please do get in touch with any of us if you'd like any more information at all. So thanks again once more to Olivia and Nadia, as well as to our audience for being here with us today, and have an amazing rest of your day.